The silent love that traveled across Europe. Before everything unraveled, before the silence and the late night pacing and the unanswered texts that kept blinking like dying stars on my screen, there was calm. I've always believed that the most dangerous love isn't the one that crashes in like a storm. It's the one that tiptoes in on quiet feet, disguised as routine, as laughter over shared coffee, as "What are you doing tonight?" Texts that start off casual but evolve into lifelines. When I first met Alina, she wasn't the type of person who sought attention. She was the kind who held her smile like a secret, her voice low, and her gaze distant, like she was always thinking about something no one else would understand. That, perhaps, was what drew me in first. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't even interest. It was curiosity, like finding a locked drawer in your own home and realizing you don't remember putting it there. We met at a book club I almost skipped. She didn't even speak much that day. Just sat there with her notebook and underlined words that I later saw were circled with strange little arrows, like she was connecting dots no one else could see. I remember she laughed once at a dry remark I made about a protagonist being an idiot, and the sound of it stayed in my head long after the session ended. The laugh wasn't loud. It was almost reluctant, but real, the kind that slips out when someone forgets to be guarded. I didn't talk to her that evening, just saw her from across the room and noted how she tied her hair like she didn't want it to be beautiful. The next time we met, she sat beside me, just like that, as if no time had passed, as if we knew each other in some life prior. And maybe we had. Some people feel like memories before they become part of your present. Her name came later. I remember asking, "So, what do you write in that notebook?" And she said, "Things I'll forget otherwise." Then, without prompting, "Alina." That was how it started, without beginning, really. Like a chapter someone accidentally began in the middle of the page. We didn't date in the traditional sense. No dinner reservations, no bouquet deliveries, no candlelit anything. We just started appearing in each other's lives like recurring songs. She showed up at my door one day with an old record she said I might like. I found myself outside her apartment 2 weeks later with lemon muffins because she once mentioned liking citrus in passing. It wasn't romantic in the glossy movie sense. It was quiet, slow, steady. The kind of love that takes root in the unnoticed hours. But what I didn't understand then, what I missed completely, was that Alina was never trying to plant roots. She was gathering stories. And I, somehow, became one. We had a rhythm. Sundays were our favorite, though never declared. She'd bring coffee, I'd make eggs. She'd sit at my small table and read aloud lines from books she never finished. Sometimes we talked about our parents, other times we just sat. One Sunday, she cried. No explanation. I didn't ask. I held her hand and let her be. Later she said, "Thanks for not making it a thing." That was the moment I realized I loved her. Not because of the way she looked at me, or how she touched me, or how she smiled when she thought I wasn't watching. I loved her because she could fall apart in silence, and I could hold that silence with her. That was what we had, a shared stillness. But stillness, I learned, is fragile, especially when you mistake it for permanence. It started with small absences. She wouldn't reply to texts as quickly. Her Sunday visits became, maybe next week. She once left a book halfway through at my apartment and never asked about it. I should have known, should have seen it coming. But I didn't, because when you love someone who keeps disappearing in pieces, you start believing they'll always return. One morning, I found a note on my doorstep. Not addressed, just folded, placed neatly like a leaf left by the wind. I didn't open it first. There was something too final about it. But when I did, it wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't even a letter. It was a list. Things I'll forget otherwise, it said at the top, and beneath, in that crooked handwriting of hers. Your laugh when you're nervous. The way you overcook eggs. That night you let me cry without asking why. Your window view. How the light hits the books at 4 p.m. No signature. No explanation. Just a list of fragments. I didn't understand. Was this her way of saying she was gone, or that she had been here at all? I called. No answer. I texted. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, and every silent Sunday felt like a cruel rehearsal of loss. Friends told me to move on, that maybe she was never really mine to begin with. But they didn't know. They didn't know how someone can weave into your days without grand gestures. How a cup of coffee in silence can matter more than declarations. I tried to forget. I really did, but everything became a reminder. The bookstore we wandered into one rainy afternoon. The song she hummed once while brushing her teeth. The chipped mug she always used, still sitting in my cabinet like a ghost refusing to leave. Months passed. Seasons shifted. I convinced myself she had moved away, maybe changed her number, perhaps found someone more stable, more present. That's what I told myself because the truth, if there even was one, was too shapeless to hold. And then one day, while clearing out my shelf, I found her notebook. The one she always carried, the one I thought she took with her. I didn't mean to open it, but I did. Inside I found pages of sketches, faces, windows, snippets of conversation. And then, near the back, a page torn in half. Only the top remained, "If I disappear." That's all. No context. Just that. The rest gone, like she meant for the sentence to remain unfinished. Or maybe that was the sentence. If I disappear? And she did. Like mist. No closure. No drama. Just absence. A void shaped exactly like her. People say you need a reason to grieve. A death, a break-up, a betrayal. But no one talks about grieving the unknown. About missing someone who never said goodbye. I kept waiting. For closure, for an explanation, for a text that said, "Sorry, I had to go." But it never came. Instead, all I had were memories and a list. A list that told me, in her own way, she had noticed me. That I had mattered. Even if only as a story she didn't want to forget. Maybe that's the most painful kind of love. The kind that's real, but only temporary. The kind that doesn't end with a fight or a lie, but with a quiet choice to walk away. Without warning, without a trace, without a reason. Just a day she forgot to come back. She vanished so cleanly it made me question if she was ever real. But the evidence of her wasn't just in memory. It was in the imprint she left on everything. Her scent lingered on my pillow for weeks after, faint and floral with some unnamed trace of melancholy. Her single earring, forgotten behind a book on the windowsill, mocked me with its permanence. Her name in my search history, my call log. Even in my dreams, everywhere I turned I met her shadow. And yet I couldn't say she had done anything wrong. No betrayal. No final argument. Just a slow erasure, a retreat so subtle it felt more like evaporation than departure. I spent the weeks that followed in denial, telling myself she was busy, overwhelmed, caught up in something she couldn't explain just yet. I waited for a knock on the door, a buzz from my phone. Anything, but the silence deepened, thickening into something tangible. Every Sunday became a ritual of disappointment. I'd brew 2 cups of coffee out of habit, stare at the chair where she used to sit cross-legged, flipping through the paper, and pretend I wasn't waiting. The H didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like confusion sharpened into longing. Because how do you mourn someone who never truly said goodbye? I started visiting the places we frequented, hoping for a trace of her. The old bookstore with the creaky floors. The pier where she once told me the sea always sounded like breathing. The tiny art supply shop where she'd buy pens she never used. Every place held echoes, but no presence. People noticed I was slipping. My friend Jordan said I looked like a man haunted by a ghost who hadn't died. Maybe I was. I wasn't eating properly. Couldn't sleep. Work became a blur, and my emails stacked up unanswered, but I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind, my chest, even my legs carried the weight of her absence like it was stitched into my muscles. Then one evening, while scrolling through my photos, I found something I had missed. A selfie she'd taken on my phone without me knowing. She was standing in front of my bookshelf, holding up a copy of The Little Prince and pulling a face, half serious, half sarcastic. She hated that book, called it pretentious. But in the corner of the image, something caught my eye. A note, taped to the side of a shelf. It hadn't been there before. I zoomed in. All I could make out was a slanted word, if. That was enough. I tore apart my apartment that night, moved furniture, checked every book spine, emptied drawers. And there it was, taped to the back of the painting she once claimed she disliked. A second note, just 2 words. Not now. I stared at it for hours. What did it mean? A message, a deflection, a promise. Was she telling me she'd return, or warning me not to look? I didn't know, but I couldn't leave it alone. I searched through every object she'd touched, every margin in her sketchbook. Days blurred again, and I became obsessed with finding more. I even messaged people from the book club to ask if they'd heard from her, but most didn't remember her clearly. She had a way of existing at the edge of rooms, barely noticeable unless she wanted to be seen. One girl said she thought Alina moved abroad. Another mentioned she had a sister in Copenhagen, but no one had a phone number. No last name, no real clue. It struck me, then, how little I knew. I didn't know her middle name, her mother's name, whether she had siblings. We'd talked so much, spent so many hours together, yet she always deflected the parts of herself that were too close to the root. She had offered me glimpses, never the whole. And I had accepted that, because I'd rather have pieces of her than none at all. But now those pieces felt like crumbs in a forest I was hopelessly lost in. I started documenting everything. Dates, moments, quotes she'd said. I opened a private folder on my laptop labeled Alina, and it became my obsession. I reconstructed our timeline, looking for patterns. She had left clues, I was sure of it. Not out of cruelty, but because she believed in meaning. She once told me, "There's no such thing as randomness. Only puzzles we haven't solved yet." Maybe this was hers. Then, one morning I got an envelope. No return address. Just my name in that unmistakable, looping handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A sketch? It was me from behind, sitting on my balcony, head tilted upward like I was listening to something. She'd captured me perfectly. The posture, the tilt of my jaw, even the way my hands curled when I thought too hard. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. In the corner, drawn with faint, almost invisible ink, was a street sign. Rue de la Clips. A quick search told me it was in Paris. A narrow, old street in the 18th arrondissement. A quiet, unassuming place. Why Paris? Had she gone there? Was she inviting me to follow? I hesitated. For days, I carried that sketch with me, folded into my wallet like a secret burning through fabric. I asked myself what it meant, what I was hoping to find. Closure? Her? Myself? Eventually I bought a ticket, one way I told no one. Just left. Paris in October is chilly, draped in soft light and perpetual gray. Rue de la Clips was easy to find but held no answers. It was residential. A bakery, a few cafes, and a small gallery at the end of the block. I walked its length a dozen times, hoping for something to jump out at me, and then on my third day I saw it. In the gallery window, a painting. Not large, not grand, but unmistakably hers. The same line work, the same delicate hands. It was a portrait. A woman in profile, but I knew it was me. Not from the face, but from the details. My watch, the faint scar on my neck, the way the collar of my coat folded. She had painted me again, and next to the painting, a title card, "For the One Who Waits." My heart collapsed inward. I walked into the gallery. The curator was an older man with kind eyes. I asked who the artist was. He smiled and said, "Alina M., no full name, just an initial." I asked if she still exhibited. He said she had left months ago. Just sent her work in from time to time. She never stayed long, never left contact details. "She's like smoke," he said. "You smell her before you see her, and by the time you turn around, she's gone." I stood there, staring at the portrait, my own face captured through someone else's lens. It didn't feel like a message anymore. It felt like a farewell. But even so, I couldn't walk away. I asked to buy it. He told me it wasn't for sale. She left instructions. "This one isn't to be owned. It's to be seen." I left the gallery shaken. I sat on a bench outside, unsure if I'd made a mistake in coming. But just as I was about to stand, a girl passed by. A tourist, I thought. She had a camera. Wore a scarf like Alina once did. And then she dropped something, a folded piece of paper. I called out, but she didn't turn. I picked it up. It wasn't blank. It had writing on it. In that same familiar hand, "You're closer than you think." No name, no date. But it had to be from her. It had to. Unless I was losing my mind. Unless the line between hope and delusion had finally vanished. That night, I wandered the city until my feet ached. Every face looked like hers. Every whisper of wind felt like her voice. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. All I knew was this: she was leading me. Somewhere. For something. And I didn't know if I was chasing her, or if she was pulling me forward, one breadcrumb at a time. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Because in a world where people vanish every day without meaning, Alina was teaching me to believe that maybe some disappearances carry purpose. Maybe she hadn't left to be forgotten. Maybe she left to be followed. I stayed in Paris longer than I planned. Originally, I told myself I'd give it a week. Just enough time to find some trace of her. Some concrete proof that all of this wasn't just an elaborate illusion crafted by grief and obsession. But 7 days turned into 10, then 14. And still I found myself waking each morning with a restless pulse and a question that refused to dissolve: where was she leading me? The city, with all its charm and narrow alleys, began to transform into a puzzle. Every street corner, every stray flyer on a lamppost or piece of graffiti on a crumbling wall started to feel like part of a code only I could decipher. I began sketching again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Not art, exactly. Just maps, lines, connections. I drew the gallery. I drew Rue de la Clips. I plotted where I'd found each note, every clue, like I was constructing a constellation with her at its center. One night, I found myself at a little cafe, tucked behind Montmartre, where the tables were too close together and the lights were always a little too dim. I sat with a notebook, rereading the lines she'd written. "You're closer than you think." And I realized something. I was so focused on chasing the places she'd been that I hadn't stopped to consider why she'd chosen them. They weren't random. Alina didn't do anything without intention. Every moment we shared was part of a pattern, one she saw long before I did. She was never trying to disappear. She was trying to leave behind something only I would understand. It was never about location. It was about memory. And that changed everything. The next morning, I returned to the gallery, not to stare at the painting again. I had done that too many times, but to talk. The curator, thankfully, remembered me. I asked him if Alina had ever spoken about her work, about the stories behind them. He frowned, then nodded slowly. She once said her pieces were memories she couldn't carry alone. That if someone else saw them, remembered them, then she wouldn't have to hold them anymore. I asked him if she'd left any other works behind. He disappeared into the back, then returned with a small folder. "She mailed this a month ago, said to display them when winter starts." But, he hesitated. She mentioned someone might come looking. Inside were 3 ink drawings. Unlike the painting of me, these were abstract. Swirls, dots, shapes. But I recognized the style. The hands. In the bottom right corner of the last one was a string of letters and numbers. At first glance, it looked random. But then I remembered Alina once told me she used to code messages into her journals using GPS coordinates. "I trust maps more than people," she'd said, half joking. I plugged the numbers into my phone. They pointed to a seaside village in southern France. A quiet place. Out of the way. Not a tourist destination. It was called Collioure. That same day, I bought a train ticket. I didn't pack much. Just her notebook, my clothes, and a small tin where I kept every note, sketch, and photograph she had left behind. The journey was long. The kind of ride that forces you to think about everything you're running toward and away from. I kept my eyes on the window, letting the scenery blur into watercolor. As we approached the coast, the air shifted. Warmer, saltier, like the breath of something ancient and unspoken. When I arrived in Collioure, I felt it immediately. The calm, the weight. It was the kind of town that moved in slow motion. Old men played cards on stoops, laundry swayed between windows. Children kicked balls down stone alleys. No one was in a hurry. I wandered without purpose, letting instinct guide me. Eventually, I found myself on a path leading up to a cliff. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, and the sun sank low, casting everything in that strange, golden stillness that only happens right before dusk. And then I saw it, a bench, weathered, rusting at the edges. But carved into the backrest was a name. A.M., just initials, but hers. Below it, in barely legible script, if you're reading this, you're exactly where you should be. I sat down. The wind curled around me like a whisper, and for the first time in months, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not relief, not clarity, just a fragile peace, a kind of pause. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. And in that breath, I felt her. The version of her that always seemed just out of reach. The one who stayed for a moment longer than she should. That night, I found a small inn on the main road. The owner, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and wine-stained teeth, asked if I was a writer. I laughed and said no, but maybe I was starting to become one. She told me Alina had stayed there once. Not long ago. Strange girl, she said, but gentle. Drew a lot. Sat by the window for hours. I asked if she'd left anything behind. The woman disappeared, then returned with a sealed envelope. Said to give it to someone if they ever looked like they'd lost her. My hands trembled. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a letter, a real one this time. No riddles, no codes. Just ink on paper, and her voice again like a song I'd forgotten. I knew you'd come, or maybe I hoped you would. I couldn't stay, not because I didn't love you, but because I did. And love, for me, has always been a fire I don't know how to hold without burning. I leave before I ruin things, before the rot sets in, before you realize I'm not who you think I am, but you saw me. That day I cried on your couch. That silence. You didn't fill it. You let it be. That was the first time I felt like maybe I could stay. I wasn't ready. I'm still not. But maybe someday I will be. And when that day comes, I hope you'll still be able to forgive my vanishing. Until then, remember me not as the girl who left, but as the one who tried to stay longer than she ever had before. I didn't sleep that night. I read the letter over and over until I could recite it without looking. And when morning came, I walked back to that bench. I sat. I breathed. And I let her go, not out of anger or grief, but out of understanding. Some people love by staying. Others love by running. Alina loved me in the only way she knew how. By leaving breadcrumbs in the dark, hoping I'd follow, not to find her, but to find what she couldn't say. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a story about being abandoned. It was a story about being seen. About loving someone not for what they give you, but for who they are. Even if who they are is someone who disappears. I stayed in Collioure for a week. I sketched. I wrote. I talked to strangers. And for the first time in a long while, I stopped chasing ghosts. I began to live again, not in spite of her absence, but because of the depth it left behind. I didn't know if she'd ever return. I still don't. But I do know this: her love wasn't a promise of forever. It was a moment. A real, impossible, beautiful moment that changed everything. And sometimes that's enough. Because the day she forgot to come back, I remembered how to find myself. I returned home from Collioure quieter than I'd left. Something had settled in me, like dust on the surface of still water. The kind of quiet that isn't numbness, but the soft acknowledgement of reality. I stopped expecting her to appear around corners or through messages left on napkins. For the first time in nearly a year, I didn't look for her in crowds or try to decode graffiti as if it was a cipher only I could solve. But that didn't mean I forgot her. That would have been easier. Instead, she became part of my rituals. Her absence embedded itself into my days like the breath between sentences, unspoken but necessary. I walked slower. Not because I was tired, but because I had learned the danger of rushing past moments. I began painting again. Real painting. Canvas, oil, mess under my fingernails. I started with abstract fragments. Echoes of her hands, her hair, the outline of her laugh. At first, they were private, almost sacred. But eventually, I showed a few to a friend who ran a small gallery in the city. She offered me a wall. Just one wall, she said. Try it. I titled the collection Missing without malice. I didn't expect much. A few nods, maybe a passing compliment. But to my surprise, the response was different. People stood still. Some cried. Others left sticky notes with memories of their own. This reminds me of the one that left without a suitcase. I never said goodbye to him, and maybe that was the goodbye. I think I finally understand why she couldn't stay. It became something larger than both of us. A dialogue in color, and that's when I understood. Alina hadn't just left me behind. She had given me a language, a new way to see, a new way to be seen. But closure is a myth. You don't finish grieving someone like Alina. You just learn to carry them differently. And sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it sends postcards. One arrived 6 months after I'd returned. No return address, just a photo. It was a beach, sun low, shadows long. In the sand, written in large letters with a stick, was one word still. I stared at it for hours, turned it over. Nothing on the back but a fingerprint smudge, almost deliberate. It didn't shake me the way it once would have. I didn't jump to catch a plane. I didn't ransack my apartment for clues. I just placed it beside her other notes and let it be. Whatever message it held, I'd already learned to listen without chasing. The gallery offered me a full exhibit after that. They said the honesty of my work drew people in. That it didn't shout, it whispered. I laughed, thinking how that was exactly how she loved. Quietly, with riddles, I called the new collection The Map Without Roads. This time I added no captions, just symbols. The shape of the chair she always sat in, a sketch of a window from her old apartment, a string of stars drawn the way she once showed me, her favorite constellation. I didn't say what any of it meant. People made up their own stories. That was the point. She had taught me that too. That meaning isn't always given. Sometimes it's built. One night, during the opening, a woman lingered in front of the constellation piece. She was older, with a scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and eyes that carried their own losses. She turned to me and asked, "Did she ever come back?" I didn't ask how she knew. I just said, "Not yet." She nodded. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes that's the lesson. I wanted to argue, but I didn't, because maybe that's true, and maybe that truth can still be beautiful. Life didn't slow down. It never does. But it changed shape. I moved to a new apartment, bigger, brighter. I painted the walls myself. I still had her notebook, though I no longer opened it often. It sat on a shelf near the window, facing the street, like a totem. A quiet thing. A held breath. One afternoon, while rearranging my studio, I found a slip of paper I hadn't noticed before. Folded into the lining of my travel bag, the one I'd taken to Collioure. It must have been there all along. I unfolded it carefully. Just one line, written in pencil. "If we're both still wandering, maybe we'll meet somewhere in the middle." That broke something in me. Not in a painful way, but like a door finally swinging open. Because for so long I thought this was a story about finding her, or losing her. But it was neither. It was a story about movement. About being brave enough to step into unknown spaces, even when the person you love disappears through them. Alina had always been moving. I just happened to walk beside her for a while, and now I was moving too. Different direction, maybe, but still forward. I didn't look for her after that. I didn't trace coordinates or decode sketches. I didn't try to trap her in memory. I simply lived. And even then, the world kept folding in on itself in strange ways. I'd find her handwriting in a second-hand book, her initials etched into the corner of a cafe table, a mural in Lisbon that mirrored one of her old drawings. Each time I smiled, because now I knew she wasn't haunting me. She was reminding me that love doesn't always stay in one place, that some stories loop instead of ending. And maybe, just maybe, she was still writing her side somewhere, letting it unfold in ink and silence. Years passed. I found new rhythms, new conversations. I loved again. Not in the way I loved her, but in ways that were equally real. I met someone who didn't vanish, who stayed through hard days and grocery lists and long pauses, who asked questions I didn't dodge, who didn't flinch when I told her about Alina. She listened and then said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." And that was the first time I cried in a long time. Not because I missed her more, but because I was finally allowed to miss her less. But just when I thought the story was finished, when I had built something whole out of absence, a letter arrived. No name on the envelope, no stamps, just placed directly into my mailbox. Inside, a folded sheet and a plain ticket. Destination Reykjavik. Departure in 3 days. No message, just a single pressed flower, crumbling at the edges. It was one she used to draw over and over again. And Edelweiss, I stared at it for hours, ran my fingers over the brittle petals, and without hesitation I packed a bag. Not out of hope, not out of desperation, but because the story wasn't over, not yet, and somewhere in the cold of the north something was calling. Or maybe someone. The moment I stepped off the plane in Reykjavik, I felt the weight of silence again. But it wasn't the same kind of silence that haunted me after she left. This one wasn't absence. It was space. A stillness so vast it felt like it could contain 1,000 voices, 1,000 goodbyes, and still echo back with something soft. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't even know if she would be there. But she had sent me here. Or someone had, and that was enough. The airport was small, the kind of place where people move slowly and everything seems touched by frost. I didn't check into a hotel right away. Instead, I walked. The cold bit at my face, and the wind carried that strange Icelandic scent, part mineral, part sea, part myth. Reykjavik was unlike any place I'd ever been. The colors were muted, yet the light was endless. Buildings looked like they'd been drawn by children with careful hands and vivid imaginations. It was surreal, quiet, and somehow familiar. I wandered until I reached the harbor. Boats rocked gently against each other, and the sea looked like molten glass. I sat on a bench and tried to remember her voice. I hadn't heard it in so long. And then I opened the letter again. There was no message, but the ticket itself was handwritten, not printed. That same careful penmanship, the same curved letters that leaned just slightly to the right. It was her, I was certain. But what was she trying to tell me? The following morning, I checked into a small guesthouse run by a woman named Sigrun, who smiled with the warmth of someone who had known loss and learned to keep loving anyway. I asked if anyone else had checked in recently with my name. She looked surprised and said no. "But I've had a reservation under AM for the cabin outside of town. No one's claimed it yet?" She paused. "Would you like to take it?" I didn't hesitate. The cabin was half an hour away by car. I rented one, driving through terrain that looked like the surface of another planet. Lava fields, icy streams, mountains that rose like giants out of mist. It felt like entering a dream I hadn't realized I'd had. When I reached the cabin, I knew immediately it had once held her. The door creaked the same way her old apartment door used to. The windows were taped at the corners with scraps of watercolor paper. Inside, it smelled of pine and ink. She had been here. Maybe not recently, maybe not long enough, but she had. There was a fireplace, a small writing desk, and a bed tucked into the corner. And on the desk, a notebook. Not hers, mine. Or at least a replica of the one I used to carry before we met. Same brand, same worn edges. On the first page, a single sentence written in her hand. "This is where you write your side." I sat for hours, not touching the pen, just looking out at the frozen lake that stretched beyond the cabin. She wanted me to tell the story, I realized, not just live it. She wanted me to make sense of it for myself. That night, I lit a fire and opened the notebook again. I wrote everything, from the first day in the book club to the gallery in Paris to Collioure to this moment. I wrote until my hand atched, until tears blurred the ink. I wrote not because I needed to find her anymore, but because I needed to find myself in everything she'd left behind. Days passed like that. No word from her, no new notes. Just me, the cold, the silence, and this strange comfort that I wasn't truly alone. On the 5th day, I hiked to a nearby hill she had sketched once in a drawing I'd found tucked into my old travel bag. It was exactly as she'd drawn it. Curved like a sleeping woman, dotted with frostbitten grass and crooked rocks. At the top, I found a cairn, a small pile of stones with a metal tin tucked inside. My chest tightened. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a Polaroid of me sleeping, my face half lit by the cabin's firelight. I didn't remember it being taken, but there it was, and on the back, in pencil, "You look less haunted now." I sat down. I couldn't speak, couldn't cry. All I could do was breathe. And then I laughed. A small, broken laugh that turned into something whole. She had been here, maybe she still was. But she was watching from a distance. That was her way. Close enough to matter, far enough not to touch. I stayed another week. Wrote every day. Let the quiet remake me. And each time I passed that cairn, I added another stone, like a breadcrumb of my own. On my last night, I lit every candle in the cabin and left the notebook open on the desk. On the final page, I wrote "If you ever come back, know that I did too." And I didn't leave angry. I didn't leave empty. I left full of the things you couldn't carry. I didn't take the notebook with me. I left it there for her, or for someone else like me, someone still following echoes. I drove back to Reykjavik with the window cracked, letting the cold sting my face. It reminded me I was alive. At the airport, just before boarding, I reached into my coat pocket for my passport and found something new. A scrap of paper, torn, folded small. No handwriting, just a line of pressed flowers, glued into the shape of a question mark. I turned it over. A single sentence. "Would you recognize me if I stayed this time?" I closed my eyes. Let the question settle. Then boarded the plane with my heart heavier, but no longer broken. Because maybe the answer was yes. And maybe, just maybe, that's what she was waiting for. Time passed. Not in the dramatic way people expect when something life-altering happens, but in quiet, consistent steps that eventually blur one day into another. Seasons changed, I moved cities, and life, as it tends to do, filled in the empty spaces. I taught myself not to look for her anymore. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I finally understood that love like hers was never meant to be chased. It was meant to be remembered. And I did, every day, in small ways. I saw her in the way light hit the rim of a coffee cup, in the hush of a morning before the world stirred, in the laughter of strangers passing by. But I stopped needing her to return in order to feel whole again. I kept painting. The gallery exhibitions became regular. My name slowly grew into something recognizable in quiet art circles, not for grandeur or brilliance, but for honesty. Critics said my work was high-yearning in color. I never corrected them, because even when you stop searching, the H of memory paints everything a little softer. I fell in love again, cautiously, like someone learning to swim after nearly drowning. Her name was Elise, a librarian, thoughtful, gentle, unassuming in a way that made you feel like being near her was enough. She didn't ask me to forget Alina. She asked me to remember her truthfully, not as a wound but as a chapter. And over time I did. We built a life together, an apartment near a park, Sunday markets, vinyl records playing while we cooked, slow evenings under blankets. We laughed. We argued about books. We danced badly in the kitchen. There were no secrets between us, but there were still silences, echoes of past ghosts that we both knew would never fully leave. And she respected that. It was peace. It was enough. Years passed. 3, to be exact. And then, like everything that ever mattered in my life, she appeared not with a bang, but with a whisper. I was speaking at a gallery in Copenhagen, presenting a new series called Cartography of Absence. 7 canvases, 7 places. Each one tied to a moment I had spent searching for her, but never depicting her directly. They were stories in negative space, images where she existed only in what was missing. After the talk, I stood in a corner of the room, half listening to small compliments, polite critiques. And then I saw her, across the room, wearing a gray coat, hands clasped, watching still. My heart didn't hitch. Instead, the world became very quiet, and I walked. One step, then another, until we stood an arm's length apart. She looked older, not aged, just softened, like glass tumbled in salt water. Her eyes still held the same storm, but they weren't trying to hide anymore. Neither of us spoke. What could we say that hadn't already been whispered across time and distance? She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded page. The last one from the notebook I'd left in the cabin. She handed it to me, her hand brushing mine like the edge of a wave. I opened it. On the back of my final message. I left full of the things you couldn't carry. She had written, I came back to carry them with you. I couldn't speak, not then. Not for a long while. Instead, we sat, on the edge of the gallery fountain, beneath a mobile sculpture of paper wings swaying slowly in the draft. She told me everything. Not all at once, but in pieces, like puzzle fragments she finally stopped keeping hidden. How she'd grown up moving constantly, never knowing permanence. How she'd loved deeply once before and lost him in a way that made her believe she was the poison. How every time she felt safe, she ran. Not to hurt, but to preserve what she loved from her own chaos. And then, how she found me. How I was different. How staying terrified her because it meant she could be seen in her entirety. And what if that was too much? Or worse, not enough? I told her I had stopped needing answers, that I had stopped needing closure, that I had built something beautiful out of the ruins she left, and that I wasn't angry. Just surprised, grateful. She asked if I was happy. I said yes. That I had become someone I could live with. That I had learned love wasn't just about presence. It was about the impression someone leaves in your life, even when they're gone. And then she asked the question that had hovered between us for years like an unopened letter. Is there still room for me? I looked at her. Not the memory of her, not the etching absence, but the person sitting beside me now, real and breathing and finally still. And I said, there always was. But I don't know what that room looks like anymore. She nodded. Maybe we build a new one, different doors. Same sky. We didn't kiss. We didn't rush. We just walked through the cobblestone streets of Copenhagen, under streetlights that blinked like stars learning to stay lit. She stayed in the city for a week. We shared coffee, visited quiet museums, exchanged books like we used to exchange silence. We didn't define it. We didn't cage it with labels or timelines. We just let it be. One morning, she left again, but this time not without saying goodbye. She left a note on my pillow. I'm not vanishing, just breathing. I'll find you again, and next time I won't run. Elise and I parted gently some months later. There was no anger, just truth. I told her what had happened. She smiled bittersweet. Some stories aren't detours, she said. They're destinations. You've just been circling your way back. I asked if she hated me. She said no. But I think you've been loving someone who hasn't had a name for a long time. Maybe now it's time you learn it fully. I kept painting. I started writing too. A memoir, though I never called it that aloud. Just a story, our story. And one day, in the middle of autumn, with leaves falling like slow confessions outside my window, I got a letter. No return address. Inside, a plain ticket. Back to Reykjavik. And on the back, same cabin. Same hill, new map. I packed lightly. Just a coat, a camera, a blank notebook. And this time I didn't go to search, I went to meet her. Not the memory, not the mystery, but the woman who had finally stopped running. When I arrived, the cabin door was open. She was sitting at the desk, my old notebook beside her. She turned, smiled. Not nervously, not apologetically, just real. And I walked in, closed the door, sat beside her. We didn't need to start over. We didn't need to finish what had been left undone. We were something new now, something truer. And as the fire crackled and wind whispered against the glass, I realized. Some love stories don't end or begin. They just arrive when you're finally ready to see them for what they are, not perfect, not easy, but deeply, undeniably ours. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.